Dr. Arthur Petersen is a professor of science, technology, and public policy at UCL. He's the chair of the Dutch Delta Program Signal Group, and he's also the editor of Zygon, the Journal of Religion and Science since 2018. His research interests include religion, science, philosophy, and atmospheric sciences and sociology. But today we're discussing his book, Climate, God, and Uncertainty, which you can read more about in the UCL, on the UCL Press. So thank you for coming, Dr. Arthur. It's really good to have you here.
Happy to be here.
Just to get started, can you just tell us a bit more about your background and what led you to write the book, Climate, God, and Uncertainty?
Yeah, it has been long in the making. And it starts from a long-standing interest in questions about science and theology already since the 1990s. But so what I've done in my career is I kind of have looked at climate change from different angles, and one of them is climate science. So I've done in the end 3 doctorates to really get to the point to get this book done. So it's a culmination of a whole career in terms of studying and work. But I started learning as much as I could about the Earth's atmosphere. So after having studied physics and philosophy, I did a PhD in atmospheric physics and chemistry, using a lot of computer simulations. And from that, a second kind of study kind of logically followed in terms of the methodology of science and also the sociology of science in terms of what's the role of computer models in science. And how can you rely on computer models of the future, for instance, of the climate system? How can you rely on them in public decision making? So you get those questions of how do you talk about uncertainty? And uncertainty has been a theme then from the start of my scientific career. First, studying what we know about the atmosphere, and then at a meta level, studying how science addresses uncertainty, both in terms of statistics and methodology. And then later, in terms of my career, I switched back and forth between academia and government. So I worked for a long time in the government, the Dutch government, even before I finished my second doctorate. I worked from the Dutch government from 2001 until 2014. In the end, became the chief scientist in the PBL, Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency, focused on the quality of information again, the quality of information going into decision-making, everything related to environmental decision-making in the country, but also what we deliver to the European Commission and the UN. So from that kind of skill in looking at the interface between science and politics and how to talk about uncertainty and models and climate change, I came back to my old kind of, I wouldn't say hobby, but it was a kind of hobby to read about theology and science by writing an article on one particular philosopher who I kind of found really exciting to learn about, an American pragmatist, William James. So he kind of published his major works at the end of the 90s and beginning of the 20th century. And that's a period that my book is largely focused on in terms of the philosophical debates then and making them relevant now. And I published an article about the question of relating to uncertainty, what you don't know. How does that look like in science, and how does that look like in religion? I really wanted to draw out that parallel through a particular phenomenon, an emotional phenomenon of wonder. So you can wonder at what you don't know about, let's say, how nature works, but you can also wonder about the divine or about what it means being saved in particular religions, in a sense, which is a very different sort of question. But for me, there's a fundamental similarity in terms of how people come to reach conclusions, judgments, I call them, in a sense, of what they think is right in a particular practice. What is a right prayer in a religious practice or a ritual? Or what is the right equation or scientific mathematical model in science? Or what is the right approach in a democracy to a decision? In politics or in law, what's the right way to reach the best kind of legal conclusion? So I discovered a lot of, by asking the fundamental question of how is uncertainty dealt with in all these different practices, I looked at a lot of similarities, and then I engaged with a couple of other philosophers. So I decided, when I had left the government and joined for a full-time academic job at UCL with a large management component, I thought, okay, I've written one article about one philosopher, about one aspect. I really want to do the full thing. I really want to get my head around this fundamental question of, in all the different world's cultures, culture kind of as an overarching concept. So not culture as just the arts, but culture as the overarching kind of set of ways we give meaning in our lives, which is very different across different societies, how cultures work. How can I address this large question? And then I decided to I have to write a book, but I don't have time to write a book. So I did something which I had the luxury to be supported for by my university, UCL. I hired a coach, which was a doctoral supervisor in the University of Oxford, to help me out, asking for chapters, giving feedback. And in that way, from 2015 to 2021, in those 6 years, when I kind of was working hard in helping set up a new department on science, technology, engineering, and public policy in London, I also worked very hard on getting that book written, which is then really it's about climate change. It's about religion. So I make reference to the word God, but it's very open in terms of, it can also be the transcendent, also open to Buddhism. So it's explicitly, there are examples from Christianity, from Buddhism, but it's also applicable to other, let's say, to Islam and Judaism, but also Hinduism and really other kind of worldviews. So for me, religion is a very, very wide net that I cast. And then, of course, the last word in the title is uncertainty, which brings everything together in my whole career. I've always focused on studying uncertainties on the atmosphere, and then at the meta level, how do sciences deal with uncertainty if they use computer models? And then the last thing is, well, how do whole societies give meaning in all their different parts of culture? When it's my fundamental kind of claim, you can never reach full certainty on the important questions. And so, yeah, that's so the background is wide, right? In terms of formal training, it ranges from physics, philosophy. I did formally this third doctorate in theology, but it's more, I would say, religious studies and philosophy of religion combined with science studies and philosophy of science. There's really a philosophy of culture that I have been trained in at the end. And I teach in public administration in an engineering faculty. So name it, and I have an interest in it. So I'm a professor of science, technology, and public policy. And what I typically say is, well, I'm interested in any science, any technology, and any level or location of public policy. So that's I'm casting the net wide, and presently I'm director of education. So I'm very much focused on how do we do the training then in that field at the doctoral, at the master's, and the undergrad level now.
That's very, very interesting. Like, what is it about uncertainty that you find so that's captivated you so much for so long? What is it about the idea of uncertainty?
That's the whole book is an answer to that question. In a sense, I'm trying to discover why myself, in a sense, also why also uncertainty. There's a negative connotation for many people, like you have a lack of knowledge. But for me, the link is so much with creativity and what is essential about being human, discovery. And which is why I have a whole chapter on poetics, right? There's a whole chapter on poetics where I have to really develop that argument that there is so much that you cannot express, but still we have to use language, and we have to use thought. Yeah, so the two other philosophers, so this is a partly answering your question. The two other philosophers that I engage with are also philosophers who address uncertainty very much. So I think William James, who is called a radical empiricist, is very much a father of psychology. but also very much focused on we will never be able to reach certainty. That's part of that whole pragmatist philosophy. There were other philosophers in that kind of pragmatist stream. So that's just a philosophy that makes me enthusiastic for, okay, what possibilities does it offer in life and in culture? Also interaction between different cultures and within cultures, and valuing plurality. The word pluriverse is also from James. I like it a lot. But the other two is, one is a contemporary, was a German philosopher, a neo-Kantian, Heinrich Rickert, who in a sense, on the basis of this longer tradition, started by Hume in a sense, and kind of one of the early peaks there was Immanuel Kant at the end of the 18th century, is really thinking about what are the limits to reason? How far can we go in terms of drawing out conclusions? And so uncertainty is a very central question there, because where is the point where you have to make step to faith, which in a sense also has an uncertain register in a way, right? Because you can faithfully recite a particular prayer, but you can also think maybe another prayer is better. So uncertainty is deeper than just a theoretical. And what I think was nicely demonstrated by Heinrich Rickert is that the atheoretical, the other domains than just theorizing and, for instance, metaphysics, but domains of religion, the domain of religion is one of them. They have to be fully valued and fully accounted for, and we have to again be aware that you cannot reach certainty there, not in their own practice, and then also not at a meta level, theoretically or philosophically. And then the third philosopher is a recently deceased French philosopher. So I have an American, a German, and a French philosopher, Bruno Latour. And Bruno Latour also can be called a philosopher of uncertainty, because he is very much, also pleading for the openness of all the different practices that he has been studying, in terms of nothing is determined. It's not deterministic. It's everything, can still develop in other directions. There are, of course, limits and bounds. Not everything is possible, but within what is possible, things can be realized that cannot be predicted. And I'm just fundamentally fascinated by it. And in terms of the way I read religion, which is not a mainstream way to read religion, so I want to clarify that. In that sense, it requires you having gone through a particular, let's say, this kind of thinking, like enlightenment, where you then still have a large value that you do attach to religion, right? There's also a track that moves into atheism. And I kind of developed this book where I fully clarified it on the philosophical front. You cannot make the choice between atheism, agnosticism, or theism. All should be life possibilities. And they are very fundamental kind of choices that people make. But even there, my claim is people should keep an open mind, while still psychologically a religion or a prayer or wonder can give psychological certainty and rest and things like that, and kind of resignation or revolt, and really gives you kind of a drive to do something where you are kind of sort of certainty, but it's a different thing. It may be a motivator, but what I always want to question is things can change. The exact views that you have can change. So never kind of fall in that trap that you think you are 100% certain. And will be difficult for some, but I found it really rewarding.
Yeah, it's interesting that uncertainty is kind of baked in even at the physical level to the physical atomic level as well, like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. Whether or not that's actual uncertainty, or whether it's maybe maybe from a God's point of view, it's not uncertain. It's just it's all known. But from a human point of view, it's very much uncertain at an atomic
The
level.
interesting thing is that maybe even if you follow that kind of philosophy of religion discussion on, for instance, quantum mechanics, where there is, I make this distinction between epistemic uncertainty and ontic uncertainty, where the ontic uncertainty is really a property of the system. So there is an inherent kind of uncertainty. For instance, with radioactive decay, you cannot predict when a particular nucleus will decay. And this is a fundamental property of creation in a sense. And I would kind of if I were to do, I don't do much philosophy of religion, but I would say that even God won't know. So there are limitations to the knowledge of God, if you really want to go in that kind of direction. But my book is not moving there at all. So I'm saying it's very fine for people to develop philosophy of religion, to develop metaphysics, to do theology, and that sort of kind of line of important element of culture and religion in a sense. But my book is again going back to this Kantianism, neo-Kantianism, is delineating how far can you go with philosophy in terms of things that you can theoretically kind of approach, and then again, there's only one thing that's certain, that nothing is certain. That's the only certainty that we have. So that's another beautiful kind of philosophical. It's not a paradox; it's a beautiful kind of statement, I think. And from there, try to get as far as we can about saying things about this side of the world, and leaving open that there are multiple options what you can say about the other side of the world. And so I don't think in philosophy, that's why I call my position naturalistic. You don't need to have a supernatural assumption in your philosophy, while still keeping an openness to a lot of religious interpretation. So that's a position I do take in this, which is part of this larger science and religion debate. There's a lot of discussion on naturalism. And I kind of indicate, well, many of the forms of naturalism that you see around are too scientistic. So people believe too much that science can explain everything. And that's not the case. So you have to keep an openness, which I then connect to that you have all these different cultural values. And if you analyze that, that requires a transcendental philosophy, which is a term from Kant. So in that sense, that's why the subtitle of the book is a transcendental naturalistic approach beyond Bruno Latour. So I hope I explained something there in terms of what you asked. But yeah, so uncertainty, I see it as something positive, and it gives us opportunity to also relate between different cultures.
Yeah, and in your book, you talk about uncertainty in the context of climate change. So how do you think society and individuals can cope with this kind of uncertainty?
I think the best way is by embracing it. And not everything is uncertain. So, but you have to start with the realization that in different cultural practices, science and religion and politics, many things can be found out, but also many things will remain deeply uncertain. So what we have found out is that humans are causing most of the climate change. That's not so uncertain, right? That's we can make a statement of fact that human greenhouse gases are warming the planet. But what exactly the consequences are, how rapidly the sea level will rise, what's the maximum for the Netherlands? I'm now the chief scientific advisor for the Delta Commissioner in the Netherlands. And if I am asked, what's the maximum number of meters that the sea level can rise in 2100? Can give them a number. The official number at the moment of the highest plausible number is 2.5 meters. But that requires that we burn a lot of coal, and that's the kind of the upper limit of what's physically even possible at the Antarctic in terms of acceleration is happening. But we don't know, right? We really don't know. We're really in the deep uncertain terrain there. And that's something that should inform our decision making. We should always really take into account that possibility does exist. And then you have to develop if you talk about societal level, at politics and organization, you need to develop what I call a planned adaptive approach to public administration, where you keep monitoring what's happening in science about the future. And then you have moments where you can say, we need to adapt. We need to, I don't know, build larger dikes, change something, give up half of the country or more in the long term. Big kind of choices, but you have to start having that discussion, which is also tragic. It's not that's not really fun if you really take everything into account. But what's also relevant is that not everybody really knows what other people's worldviews are. So there's issues there in terms of if you talk about science on climate change and you just impose on particular indigenous population that they need to adapt in a particular way. That's where issues start getting off the rails in terms of how modern culture, non-modern cultures relate, and that those types of uncertainties. My book is also about that in terms of the difficulties for the kind of scientists who do have a scientific kind of tendency typically in modernity, how they can become a little bit more humble and find ways to be more diplomatic and engage. But it's not, there's no recipe for it, and it's hard, and there's no one who really knows how you can do that well in terms of, yeah, we have typically in the West emitted a lot of emissions, and then there's a risk that we in the West are asking people who live in tropical forests to get the carbon out of the atmosphere for us, for instance, right? By all sorts of ways. This is one discussion that has been there. There's deep kind of ethical issues and political issues, but there's also the deeper worldview questions that play a role there too. And yeah, this is I find that interesting and important. But yeah, these are all dimensions that don't make it fun just to deal with the uncertainties. But once you realize that these differences are there and these pluralities are there, you have to deal with it and you have to be honest about it.
Mm-hmm. And what are the key philosophical implications of climate change that you think are not adequately addressed by scientists and the scientific community?
Yeah, well, the scientific community has a particular concept of nature, which is often very limited because it means nature as you can study it with the natural sciences.
Mm-hmm.
And I do a lot in my book, and I use Bruno Latour to really have a very expansive concept of nature. Nature is the world. Values are part of nature. It's not just what you can study with scientific tools. So what you learn there from climate change is the scale of our impact. So we, people, are a part of nature, and we're changing the planet and also how we relate to it. So that's one element, right? In terms of, you can say ontology, in terms of nature is something we are part of. And you really have to rethink how we are part of nature and take into account in your philosophy that the planet is not just environment. We are part of the planet. And the Anthropocene, in terms of geological terms, makes that very clear, that we are shaping at the geological time scale, even the shape of the planet. So that's on our concept of nature. I think another key philosophical implication of climate change is, and this debate I have been very much involved with, is the debate with what is called the climate skeptics, which started in a sense following up also from discussions in the 1990s on sound science. So it was really, there was a moment in the US when it nearly became law that you could not take any environmental measures if it were to be based on models. Just didn't happen. But all our knowledge is based on models. It's the best that we have. It's the only thing that we can do.
Yeah, even economic knowledge is all based on models.
Economic knowledge, all based on models. And I think the models on environment are better than the models in economics. That's a very good point. So that points out that there is a larger question of who has power, which kind of decisions impact which people, what are the lobbies around. So you really have to have an open mind about that. But what we have learned, what kind of science studies have shown since the 1970s is that science is also a people enterprise. It's a human construct. and it's even more than a human construct. I like the actor network theory approach that Latour also developed with colleagues, is all these different actors are uncertain in their behaviors. Also, the non-human actors have behaviors that are not entirely predictable. Without, you don't have to assign kind of will to them. That's a different discussion. But from that, you see that the whole image of how science works has opened up. So I don't think the climate skeptics have some interesting points to make about uncertainties that some scientists may want to hide. That word has actually been used in the controversial email exchange that was exposed in 2009. Let's hide the decline, which was just a methodological, and it was a choice, and it was a well underpinned choice in many respects, to only show part of a record based on tree rings on what the temperature showed, because in more recent kind of years, while there was warming, there was also air pollution, and the tree ring temperature correlation was different. And for that, those kind of years should be not included in the reliable data of using tree rings to measure temperature. But if you start calling it hide the decline, then of course the skeptics jump on that. And they kind of made a valid point, the skeptics, is that you have to make those choices all the time. You have to make methodological choices, and you can also make them differently. So other people may disagree and may have different ways that that data should be portrayed, or that we should look at different methods or different statistical techniques. And it's really important to keep that open so that people are aware that science is a developing enterprise. Again, the uncertainties come in. Uncertainties are something that should be made visible. And in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, I think this has been a major milestone in terms of a philosophical implication of climate change. Having an Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, having the scientific community come together and really think deep about the uncertainties and communicate about them. They needed some help in becoming as reflective as they needed to be, but they did. I think is one of those, one of those things that have changed also how science operates in its larger context. So many people become more aware of a lot of work that's going in doing science. You have to do the measurements, you have to do the models, you have to make all the links, which is called all the chains of reference. And you cannot just sit in your armchair and say, I don't believe it. The only way you can fight it if you don't believe it is you have to build your own laboratory, which is very much a phrase also from Bruno Latour, which I think is a very fair point. And that's a deep philosophical implication, that science involves all these networks, and it's not just sitting in an armchair or doing a little bit of a lab experiment and making conclusions from that.
Yeah, and you mentioned the idea about values, right? And current scientific paradigm is very narrow in its scope about how it perceives nature, and that it excludes ideas about values and so on. So how do you think that should change, or the idea of science should change, so that it includes, is more effective in addressing climate change as it includes values and different perspectives?
So I think that as a society, we have already come a long way with all the values that we already hold. And I think science should stick to its values as science. And their role is really to discover what the kind of, how you can best represent, make reference to what's happening in the world. But you need to find more ways and training for scientists to be reflexive of the larger cultural context in which they operate, and the plurality within science, or even within different subdisciplines, or between different subdisciplines. There may be much disagreement on how you look at a particular problem, and that should be made productive. It should not be threatening. It should be shown that it's all right, and it's really good to to have those uncertainties. Where the problem lies is, of course, where there's science overstepping its kind of role. So and that's called scientism.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then I've seen scientific forms of naturalism, right? So that can lead to a disenchantment of nature if you say there's nothing but atoms. I don't think it's even a correct representation of what science does or what you can say from science. So you put a metaphysics on top of science, which may well be true or whatever, right? So there's all sorts of things, but you can never prove it philosophically. So I'm very, very much clarifying there that people should be aware, when are you imposing your own religion?
Mm-hmm.
Also as a scientist, maybe believing in atheism or whatever. That's a different discussion than what you can do with science itself.
And do you think part
yeah.
of the issue is because scientists are not really trained in the philosophy of science or have little understanding about it? They don't understand the assumptions that science requires in order to conduct science. You know, you have to have the faith that you have to have the fundamental belief that the future will behave like the past.
Yeah.
You have to
There is a problem with the training that we do, which is too monodisciplinary in many degrees. It's much better to have a wide education where you have also humanities and social sciences as part of your basic kind of background, so that you can still fully be a scientist and fully go for it. But yeah, it's just healthy if you can make this larger connection. So one other example is what scientists don't often realize is, and it's very clear in kind of 17th century science, there's a strong link between poetics and science as well. It's all about the human imagination. So there's a very interesting link between humanities and doing science. And there are different ways to do science. And what I'm also interested in is that science and engineering are done also slightly differently in different countries. So how is it done in an African setting? How's it done in an Indian setting? How's it done in a Latin American setting? So there is all these elements that color how we do science, where if you put them next to each other, you see that you have to learn and talk about it. And the more exchange you have internationally, the more exchange you have between different disciplines in academia. And in Dutch, we have the word wetenschap, and in German, Wissenschaft, which means we have a very broad meaning of science, which includes the social sciences and humanities as part of the larger kind of enterprise that you, in an Anglo-Saxon world, often with science, you delimit it to the natural sciences. And I think widening this up would be really beneficial for everyone.
It's interesting you mentioned poetics, because I think I was reading some time ago about the impact of writing and poetry. How writing is very linear in the way you think. When you write something down, your train of thought is very linear and you follow like a very logical argument. But when poetry is often an oral tradition, and with oral traditions, you know, when you speak, it's not very linear. You go on tangents all the time, and it's a very different way of thinking about the world. So when you separate the two, people tend to think in very distinctive ways. But in the past, people used to have a lot more, a lot more holistic in their education as well.
Yeah.
So they could think.
And this is an example you can see in the difference between how articles or pieces were written in the 17th century and now. Now we kind of reconstruct and do as if everything we did in the lab went as planned, linearly reconstructed. But in reality, it's a chaos and cycles, and you make sense of things. And of course, there is a methodological element, and you have to kind of make sure that you kind of knew what you were doing. At least you think you know what you were doing. So yeah, that element is still there, but it's made invisible in how we now kind of write our scientific articles, and also how we then portray it in our textbooks.
Yeah, and moving on. For the last few hundred years, science and religion have been like rubbing with each other with some degree of friction. How do you think that relates in the area of climate change? And do you think there's a harmony there, or are they inherently in conflict?
In general, I don't see there's an inherent conflict between science and religion, because that's in my kind of philosophy. They really concern different values. Either you want to get information, or In some religions, you want to be saved. There's hardly any link between the two, is my claim. So that's at the outset a kind of statement from my side. And of course, religions make theoretical claims, and of course there are religious implications involved in science. And then you have to look at, okay, those are interesting interactions, and there may be all sorts of conflicts there, and you have to kind of study how you handle those. Which means, for me, on the science side, I would not really allow supernatural causes to be part of my science. That's my naturalism. But I also wouldn't allow a technologist to determine what values we should hold in terms of life, if we make life and death decisions. And that's on the other side, right? So and you can easily see the conflicts arise, and they are legitimate conflicts, but they are not fundamental conflicts, because in a sense, both science and religion are essential ingredients of our culture. Now, in terms of the link between science and religion, I really like to further think about poetry and poetics and what are ways, you can capture humanity's relation to the rest of creation through poetics and poetry. And some people try to do that. I find it fascinating, but I'm not totally convinced by evolutionary stories and connecting it to how beautiful creation is from a scientific perspective, and then try to make that into poetics and try to make that into kind of religion in a way. I don't think that will work, but I think it's fascinating, and it's something to really look at. So that's an interesting kind of thing where you can have new metaphors arising from science that can enter also in the religious discourse. But more generally, I think yes, in terms of in religion, also religious institutions, there are all sorts of ways that you can relate to what we have discovered through science about climate change, and then how to relate to that. So it's a good trigger, but it's really still a very different register, and they're complementary. And where there are conflicts, there are some real conflicts, but they are kind of specific issues at the intersection between those two valuable domains.
Yeah, I agree with that. And lastly, how do you think the ideas in your book can be applied practically, both in policy making and in grassroots environmental movements?
Well, I think that in the book, it has two parts. So one is the developing my philosophical position, which is kind of technical in a philosophical sense. So I developed transcendental naturalism by talking about wonder. I talk about judgment. I talk about values, talk about models, and try to make sense of that. So that's one part. The second part is where the application to climate and politics is made, and there, looking at the examples that I bring to bear. One is, how can we give poetic expression to nature that can help in ecological conservation? That's one example from one of the chapters. Chapter 6 and chapter 7, there is a kind of thing where I talk a lot about how the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change works. And yeah, how can also in the grassroots environmental movements, you shouldn't say just the science says it, so we must act. And also the science is not 100% certain about everything. And be careful there, is my message. So it does help the grassroots environmental movements to be fully aware of all the risks and the science. But they need to get their kind of ethics, their kind of arguments, and their politics from other registers than science. It's not scientists that tell us how we should run the world. But yes, there are implications, right? In terms of being in the tragic situation that we have emitted too much greenhouse gases, sea levels are rising. That's a fact. And you have to take it into account. But I want more care. That's my recommendation to grassroots environmental movements in how they relate to science, and use more the risk register and the uncertainties. They're actually making it stronger, their argument, instead of claiming that we are certain that particular apocalyptic things are going to happen. I don't think that's a good strategy. And then the final thing in my chapter 8, I really think about modern planning methods, which kind of have a scientific, naturalistic tendency in the way they use science. If we talk about how we apply knowledge about climate science in terms of reducing emissions or adapting to climate change, when we just apply that in Latin America and Africa and Asia, and also how there's a disregard for non-modern worldviews on the one hand, and on the other hand, how non-modern worldviews find it really hard to relate to science. I think there is an important element for grassroots environmental movements to relate, not just to, which are typically done in the West, how they kind of can relate more fundamentally to indigenous peoples. And that requires more humility and acknowledgement of diversity across the world, and that we have to really work. We are in a situation together, but we are in a different situation from other people that may not have created the problem and whose life worlds may have been shattered already before through colonial times, etc., etc. But I think there's a lot of naivete in the grassroots environmental movements about claiming to also speak for the whole of humanity, and I think that's very unethical.
Yeah, that's a good point actually about the environmental movements and popular science, because even I noticed that too often people say science says X, therefore you have to do something else. When science doesn't actually have any idea of what's good or bad, it just tells you something, there's a cause here and there's an effect there. It's our values which say, oh, CO2 is harmful. Science doesn't say CO2 is harmful. It says our values optimize for human flourishing, and therefore, in that context, the CO2 can be harmful.
But don't get me wrong, there is a flip side. I am not saying that scientists should stay out of politics, should say we are just doing science, we're not doing politics. Because, and that's a really good analysis by Bruno Latour, they are the ones that see the signals of, for instance, on the Antarctic melting. And they bring that into politics. So in that sense, they have a very strong way of doing politics by bringing in the signals. And then the question is, what are the ways they try to make those signals relevant for decision making? And that is a form of doing politics, but it's not the same as you say, science says X, and therefore we have to do Y. You need more reasons.
Yes, science communication is a whole different realm itself, and how to communicate to the public. That's a different kind of science in that sense.
It is. It's an art, and also there are more training.
Because even now we see all these conspiracy theories emerging and whatnot, just from the flood of information there is, because some science has been taken out of context. So there's a massive need for.
But this is why we created this program we have at UCL, this Masters of Public Administration, which is really training people to talk in the right way about science in a political setting.
Yeah, it's a real need for that. Thank you very much. I think it was very, very helpful talking about your book. I'm sure everyone who's listening would have very benefited from it, especially the talk about uncertainty. I think it's a very, very useful and interesting element that we too often neglect, especially as technology takes over our lives more and more, and we think everything is certain, but really, it's just
the nice thing about this
fragile
UCL
system and
Press,
lots of uncertainties.
Yeah, UCL Press has this philosophy since the start of only publishing open access, so everybody can download it for free.
Okay, wonderful. So it's open access; everyone can access it. Yeah, I'll get the link and I'll put it in the video. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Doctor.
Bye bye.